So the question is, how can I offer up my sufferings? And what is the connection between suffering and prayer? Well, I lived for 2 years in Lithuania. And Lithuania is a country that has about 60 days of sunshine a year, meaning about 300 days of cloudiness. And people there have a very suffering attitude. And one of the first things I'd like to say is to be a little bit cautious when we talk about suffering and offering up for prayer, because we can get into this idea that the more I suffer, the better it is, the better my prayer is. And that can get us into some dangerous ground. So let's first of all say that suffering can be something that we can transform into something that is good through our prayer, but we don't look for suffering in and of itself unless there's a very specific call that we discern with our spiritual director. So that's the first thing, because we can get into the idea that, okay, if I'm suffering, well, maybe I can make myself suffer more and that'll be even better for my prayer life. So let's not get into that. The Lord suffered, but we can't say that suffering is something that we want to search for. The Lord will bring suffering to our life. That's another thing. When some suffering comes our way, suppose that I get diagnosed that I have some disease and I'm going to have to go through some treatment that's painful. Well, I can't do a whole lot about it. I'm going to offer that suffering. Yet the connection between suffering and prayer is so important because it helps to give meaning to my suffering. One of the most dehumanizing events in our life is when we have suffering that we can't give meaning to. It can disintegrate the fiber of our being very, very quickly, and we can fall into great despair. So I think that what prayer does is that it allows me to give a meaning to what I'm going through that might be difficult and to put it into a larger context. One of the results of suffering is that it can make me sort of turn in on myself, and I just see myself and my suffering. Whereas if I'm able to put that into the context of God calling me to Himself, of God calling me to holiness, I can offer that suffering in view of something greater than myself. And that can liberate me to a certain extent from the weight of the suffering. It won't take away necessarily the pain, but it will make it so that I can direct that pain in view of something. That pain becomes meaningful because I can say, okay, I'm going to let this be in view of perhaps helping my neighbor get to know Jesus, or I can offer this in view of maybe making up for whatever sins I've committed, or I can offer this up for the holy souls in purgatory, something like that. And so that's where you come with that word that you said, intentional. I can give an intention to that suffering. It's not like I'm intentionally suffering, but I can make that suffering be transformed through the intention that I give it, and it gives it a certain form, and it makes it so that it becomes like a sweet-smelling sacrifice to the Lord. We hear about this in the Old Testament, these sweet-smelling sacrifices. And, well, we hear in one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 109 or 115, one or the other, my offering is the offering of thanksgiving. So also one of the places where we can suffer is that, and this will sound sort of strange, is that we can become accustomed to a certain way of suffering and that we can not want to let go of that suffering. And one of the great sacrifices we can make is to let go of a certain suffering that maybe we're holding on to. That might not make sense, but suppose that someone has a problem with an addiction of some sort, can't stop drinking. Well, okay, there's a certain suffering that is going on, and there's a point where the person no longer has the ability to say no. But at one point, there is that first drinker, that first bite, that first movement towards the object that is addictive. And there can be almost like getting used to that suffering, and it becomes so comfortable, not in the sense that I find it extremely easy to be in that suffering, but it can be comfortable in the sense that it's familiar. And I can have a hard time letting go of that familiar sort of like path that I take. And to let go of that familiar path implies a sort of like suffering, like weaning from that path. And that letting go of that path can in itself be a suffering because I'm used to it. It becomes almost a friend, a companion. And people talk about the fact that when they have, for instance, a drinking problem, alcohol becomes their friend. Even though it causes such great suffering and havoc, it wreaks havoc in their life, it becomes a friend because that alcohol is always there. So There is that suffering of admitting that maybe there was a loneliness that was drawing me towards that object of addiction, and that suffering of admitting, okay, maybe I need to make a change in my life. So these are just different levels of suffering. It's not in a really great order, but what came to mind were these reflections. I think one of the most important things is to see that no matter what the suffering is, I can give it meaning. Now, the connection between suffering and prayer is that in my prayer, I can offer up these sufferings. I can offer up these difficulties. But again, it's important to see, well, where may I be generating these sufferings? And I may be in some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? Because of maybe my behavior, it makes me feel left out, therefore I suffer. Therefore, because I feel left out, I have that same behavior, and it becomes like this circle. So I think it's also important to see every once in a while with our spiritual director, where am I suffering, and what might I be doing to contribute to the fact that these sufferings are taking place in my life? And there might be a call to change. And of course, that change can be difficult because it is familiar the way that I'm acting. And maybe I'm getting something out of this suffering that makes me feel like, okay, I'm sort of a martyr, I'm sort of, I can offer it up. So I think there's a question of discerning, are these sufferings the Lord really wants me to be doing, or could I be contributing to the fact that I am living these difficulties? And so there's always that question of, where do I need to grow? Where do I need to allow the Lord into my life? Where might I need healing? Where might I need to have some guidance in some aspect of my life? But we all go through suffering. And whatever the suffering is, we can, through prayer, offer it to the Lord. So this can be sometimes suffering like, okay, Lord, it's too much. It can be like crying out to the Lord. Some people have come to me and said, oh, I cried out to the Lord. I got mad at him. Well, I don't think that's such a horrible thing. At least you're paying attention to the Lord, right? It's much better than indifference. So we can say, okay, Lord, this is too much. Good, at least you're in dialogue with the Lord. The most important thing is to continue to bring it to Him. And then when we go to Mass, we can offer up that suffering in the Eucharist. Jesus offers up the sufferings of His passion in the Eucharist. We can join our sufferings to His offering on the altar, and that is how we become one living sacrifice to the Lord.